Even before the beginning of hostilities, it was recognized that one of Canada's principal roles would be to provide an air training ground where, as in 1917 to 1918, instruction could be carried on away from the actual battle area. Representatives of the governments of the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada met in Ottawa, and on 17 December 1939 signed an agreement setting up the BCATP, the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, thereby preparing the way for making Canada what President Roosevelt later termed the aerodrome of democracy. The original plan provided for 3 initial training schools, 13 elementary flying training schools, 16 service flying training schools, 10 air observer schools, 10 bombing and gunnery schools, 2 air navigation schools, and 4 wireless schools. Supplementing these were numerous other units for recruiting, training, maintenance, and administration, making a total of 74 schools and depots. When fully developed, this establishment was expected to produce every month 520 pilots with elementary training, 544 pilots with service training, 340 air observers, and 580 wireless operator air gunners. The first schools were scheduled to open at the end of April 1940, and all were to be in operation within 2 years. The responsibility for establishing, administering, and operating this great plan was placed on the shoulders of the RCAF and its total complement of scarcely more than 4,000 officers and airmen. The number of aircraft required, estimated at 3,540, was more than 12-fold the number of military aircraft in all Canada in 1939, and the plan called for a staff of 33,052 Air Force personnel and 5,951 civilians, a force 8 times larger than the entire complement of the RCAF. It was a gigantic task. Sites for dozens of aerodromes had to be selected, roads and runways built, hangars, barracks, and other buildings erected. Incredible quantities of equipment from thumbtacks to airplanes had to be procured. An army of experts had to be recruited. Doctors, dentists, chaplains, technicians, executives, mechanics, bookkeepers, cooks, teachers, flying instructors, to receive, examine, equip, instruct, and train the thousands of young men who were clamoring to enlist. Around the nucleus of RCAF personnel and the specialist RAF officers who had been sent to assist them, a force of skilled men from all walks of life rapidly gathered. Among them were many of Canada's leading businessmen and engineers, many of her best-known doctors, bush pilots, scientists, and lawyers. From the United States came American commercial pilots, eager to help in what they even then considered the common cause. In the initial stages, the Department of Transport gave invaluable assistance in selecting and surveying sites for flying fields, and civilian flying organizations took over the task of running the elementary and air observer schools. In the spring of 1940, the first schools opened and training began on schedule. A crisis developed in the late summer when, as a result of the desperate situation overseas after Dunkirk, the delivery of Anson trainer aircraft dropped to about 1/2 of what was expected. Without hesitation, the Canadian government took the initiative and trusted the provision of aircraft to a Crown company, Federal Aircraft Limited. The plan was kept moving in high gear, but until the latter part of 1941, when Canadian airplanes became available in quantity, many students trained on Harvards obtained from the United States instead of on Ansons. In the fall of 1940, Air Vice Marshal L.S. Bredner, the Chief of the Air Staff, was able to announce that the success of the BCATP was no longer in doubt. By the end of September 1941, 7 months ahead of schedule, all but 3 of the BCATP schools were in operation, and 8 additional elementary schools had been opened. In June 1942, the number of training schools was increased to 67, including 21 double schools, and 10 new specialist schools were added for operational training, training flying instructors, and other functions. In addition, the administration of 27 Royal Air Force units, which had been transferred to or set up in Canada, was also entrusted to the RCAF. At the close of 1943, when the plan reached its maximum expansion, 97 BCATP and RAF schools and 184 ancillary units were in operation. Over 3,000 students were graduating each month, and the plan had already produced almost 82,000 trained aircrew. So large was the reserve of aircrew in excess of immediate overseas needs that early in 1944 it was possible to reduce the training program. The closing of schools was accelerated in October of that year, and at the end of March 1945, the BCATP was officially terminated. In 1942, a new cost-sharing arrangement was worked out whereby Australia and New Zealand paid for their air training in Canada by a lump sum or per capita basis instead of accepting a percentage of the total costs, as they had in 1939. Britain, however, agreed to accept a large portion of the overall expense, roughly equal to 50% of the cost of the plan less the amounts paid by Australia and New Zealand. In 1946, the Canadian government cancelled Britain's outstanding indebtedness for the BCATP, a sum amounting to $425 million. All of this was not accomplished without sacrifice, and more than 2,300 Air Force personnel were killed in Canada during the war, although not all of these were BCATP casualties. In the beginning, only 3 types of aircrew were trained: pilots, air observers, and wireless operator air gunners. But the expansion of air operations overseas, and in particular the introduction of the 4-engine bomber with its larger crew, made it necessary to modify and extend the training program. Before the war ended, the plan was producing 8 different aircrew categories: pilot, navigator, navigator B with bombing training in addition to navigation, navigator W, additional wireless training, air bomber, wireless operator air gunner, and flight engineer. The ultimate total output of the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan was 131,553 aircrew, including almost 50,000 pilots, 18,500 wireless operator air gunners, and 15,900 navigators. More than 55% of the graduates were members of the RCAF. The RAF contributed 32% of the trainees, the Royal Australian Air Force slightly more than 7%, and the Royal New Zealand Air Force about 5%. In addition, 2,629 pilots and 704 air gunners were trained for the Royal Navy's Fleet Air Arm.